to that. But first, I want to start by acknowledging an event that happened, of which the anniversary of which, the 96th anniversary of which we celebrated yesterday, about the greatest event in human history, the Great October Socialist Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which changed the balance of forces in the world in favor of workers and oppressed people everywhere, including right here. When we're fighting to raise the minimum wage or fighting to defend Social Security and all the things that try and take away unemployment insurance, the 8-hour day, we have those things in large part because of the Bolshevik Revolution that empowered the class struggle in this country and around the world. For 73 years, the bulk of the 20th century was a war by the major imperialist powers, by German imperialism, by U.S. imperialism, by British imperialism to destroy the Soviet Union. And it was a war against workers everywhere. The fall of the USSR was one of the greatest tragedies the people of the world have experienced, and we can see that in what's happened to the living conditions of workers in this country since the USSR fell. It was a victory for the bosses, it was a victory for the capitalist class, but nonetheless, it did change the world. And when we see today that oppressed countries, even like Iran, are able to stand up to U.S. imperialism, that's in a large part due to the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution. People in the United States, this is also relevant to tonight's discussion because when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, the Tsar of Russia was party to a deal between Britain and France to divide up the Middle East. It was called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And the Bolsheviks exposed that treaty to the world, and they renounced any part of it. That was after World War I. The Britain had promised the Arab people independence if they would rise up against the Ottoman Empire. Then they came in and carved up, and Britain took Palestine and Iraq, and France took Syria and Lebanon. And this is the struggle that's been going on in that part of the world to this day. People in the United States, working class and oppressed people, that is, owe thanks to Syria, Iran, the Lebanese resistance, Russia, China, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Because their alliance was the main factor that made the bankers stayed in Washington, and that's what it is no matter who lives in the White House, back down from a direct U.S. attack on Syria, at least for now. Since the Cold War supposedly ended in 1991, since the Soviet Union was destroyed, the U.S. military has been on a rampage. U.S. troops have invaded and occupied Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Haiti. U.S. planes have rained bombs and missiles on Libya and Yugoslavia. U.S. drones massacre families in Pakistan and Yemen. When President Obama backed down from attacking Syria, it was the first public U.S. military retreat since the fall of the USSR. 8 weeks ago, the Obama administration seemed almost desperate to risk both world war and political suicide for the sake of attacking Syria. Now the U.S. is opening talks with Syria about, has accepted a deal with the Syrian government about chemicals, which basically is a stand down of a military attack, and urging the rebels to negotiate with the Syrian government in Geneva, and they're talking about a nuclear deal with Iran. The White House says it wants to ease sanctions on both countries. It's also cut aid to Egypt's military regime. President Obama told the UN General Assembly that we are shifting away from a perpetual war footing in the Middle East. And White House National Security Advisor Susan Rice told the New York Times that we can't just be consumed with one region 24/7, no matter how important it is to us. Leading members of the Saudi royal family, including intelligence chief Prince Bandar bin Sultan have denounced the U.S. for not attacking Syria and for negotiating with Iran. So has Netanyahu of Israel, but you knew that. Prince Bandar said Saudi Arabia is shifting away from the United States and would continue to arm and aid the Syrian rebels on its own without U.S. help or working with France. Prince Bandar, when leading members of the royal family of Saudi Arabia or of the Israeli government speak out against the United States, they're not speaking on their own. The Saudis have trillions invested in the United States, and Bandar has long ties with the U.S. deep state apparatus. The entire state of Israel is virtually a part of the U.S. military-industrial complex. They speak with the blessing of those on Wall Street, those in the U.S. ruling class who think, in the words of Washington Post columnist Charles Krauthammer, that Obama chickened out on Syria. Many on Wall Street had hoped an attack on Syria would bring them the same profit bonanza they got from the war against Iraq. The dollar rose on the prospects of that war war with Syria. So did ExxonMobil stock, even though their profits have been down this year. Raytheon, the maker of Tomahawk missiles, saw its stock rise as well. Their voice, the voice of those in the U.S. ruling class who feel this way, was heard when Congress voted against Obama's request to postpone new sanctions on Iran. If Obama were to fall on his political sword to make them richer, that's not a problem for them. From Roosevelt to JFK, capitalists have had little empathy for those who try to save them from themselves. And historically, Obama knows that historically Republicans have benefited from wars the Democrats start. In fact, speaking of détente, this is actually the struggle that's now seems to be emerging in the U.S. ruling class over Obama's overtures to Iran is reminiscent to me of the attacks on JFK for not going to nuclear war with the Soviet Union over Cuba in the early 60s. JFK was publicly executed for that 50 years ago this month. But the world has changed a lot materially since then. The opposition to Kennedy and to Kennedy's backing down on Cuba was led by the military, by especially General Lyman Lemnitzer, who was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This time around, it was General Martin Dempsey, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff today, who reportedly told Obama the U.S. military is not ready for a prolonged war in the Middle East that could involve Russia and Iran. Does this mean that Washington's long war, the U.S. long war in the Middle East, is over? It's a war that's been going on for decades, from long before 9/11, from long before even the Iranian Revolution. The CIA and the Marines have been intervening, or they've been arming Israel to intervene against the Arab people on behalf of right-wing, pro-U.S., pro-imperialist monarchies against Republican nationalist movements. Let's be clear, the war against Syria continues. So does the war against Palestine, no matter what's happening in Geneva. People are still dying in the streets of Damascus and in the countryside, in Halab and Homs. The terror bombings continue. Polio is spreading across Syria. Millions are still homeless. Sorry, I lost the point I was going to make here. Oh yeah, I'll get to it. Okay. And on October, last week, 2 weeks ago, on November 1st, October 31st, the United States did finally launch airstrikes on Syria, or rather U.S. warplanes attacked Syria. The U.S. government announced the attack. The planes were, they said it was done by Israel. But the only difference between a U.S. airstrike and an Israeli airstrike is the colors painted on the fuselages of the F-16s, because all of the Israeli Air Force's planes are made in the United States. The air-to-surface missiles they use are made in the USA. Israeli pilots are trained in the USA and can be U.S. citizens. Israel's military machine runs on U.S. dollars. The very evening of the attack, U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel told a Zionist dinner in New York City that Israel would be the first state to receive the Marine Corps' new V-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft, and that production was being sped up to get them over there quickly. The Israeli and American defense relationship is stronger than ever, and it will continue to strengthen, he said. On November 1st, the day after the attack, the House Armed Services Subcommittee proposed a nearly $500 million increase in U.S. military aid to the racist Israeli state. That's on top of the $5 billion that the U.S. has already giving to the Israeli military this year, which is about the same amount they cut from food stamps that very day. That's what Israel is there for. That's why it's worth its weight in gold to the U.S. imperialist ruling class, because it can act. It's not because some Zionist lobby controls the United States. It's because Israel can act, giving the United States plausible deniability. That was true in 1948 when they created it. It was true in '67 when Israel's war against Egypt and Syria turned the balance of forces in the Arab world in favor of the U.S. puppet monarchies like Saudi Arabia, while at a time when the U.S. was tied down in Vietnam. And as far as Saudi Arabia breaking with the United States and saying it's going to arm the Contras on its own, the Contras in Syria on its own, does Saudi Arabia produce arms? No, Saudi Arabia is the biggest customer of the U.S. arms industry. And in fact, in all the media hype about the rift, this alleged rift between Saudi Arabia and the United States, I saw no mention of the fact that 4 days earlier the Pentagon announced it was selling $11 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, including bunker busters and air-to-ground missiles. And let's remember that when the U.S. Congress refused to approve U.S. aid to the Contras in Nicaragua, Reagan's war against the Sandinist government in Nicaragua, Saudi Arabia footed the bill, just like they footed most of the bill for the CIA's war in Afghanistan. That's what they do. That's what the relationship is. I do want to comment on a fact that surfaced in the news a couple of weeks ago, which is that the U.S. is now the world's, I mean, we know that 52% of the world's oil reserves, roughly, known oil reserves, lie in the Arabian Peninsula, under the Arab Gulf, in Iraq, about a 12-hour drive from Damascus. However, in October it was announced the United States had surpassed Saudi Arabia and Russia as the world's #1 oil and gas producer. And it was also announced later that month that China has replaced the United States as the largest importer of oil from the Middle East and even from Saudi Arabia. Some say, there's a lot of speculation that this means the U.S. will play less of the Middle East has become less important to U.S. imperialism, to the U.S. ruling class. That's what Obama is saying, energy independence equals no need for U.S. troops in the Middle East. That might be true if the United States were in the Middle East to get oil. But let's be clear, nothing the U.S. has done from the war in Iraq or the propping up of the Shah's regime in Iran for 25 years was about getting oil. It was about oil. It was about money, the profits from oil. Like General Motors president once said, we're not in business to make cars, we're in business to make money. And profit does not always come from maximizing production. It often comes from restricting it. That's what monopoly is about. The capitalists are not afraid of shortages. Their crisis is too much. When Obama spoke to the UN on September 24th, he made a whopper worthy of George Bush or Richard Nixon. He said, we will continue to use the full force of the United States, the full power, all the elements of our power, including force, to ensure the free supply of energy from that region of the world. When has the U.S. ever defended the free supply of energy? Iraq? They sanctioned Iraq for 20 years. They kept them, or for 12 years, they kept them from selling their oil on the world market. They destroyed the Iraqi oil industry. After NATO bombed Libya, its oil production went down from 200,000, it dropped, I'm sorry, I don't have the figures in front of me, it dropped to like 10% of what it was. They've tried to strangle Iran's nationalized oil industry for 35 years. When the CIA overthrew Syria's government in 1949 in order to build the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, when they overthrew the democratically elected Iranian government in '53, or when they began conspiring to overthrow the government of Qasem in Iraq in '58, the U.S. imported hardly any oil from the Middle East. But half the overseas profits of U.S. companies were generated by U.S. oil companies in the Middle East. And back then, most of the oil in the region was directly owned by U.S. oil companies. That's no longer true. And the wave of nationalization that swept the area in the 70s, which was in large part a response to Nixon's taking the dollar off the gold standard to alleviate the cost of the Vietnam War, and which really hurt the incomes of the countries that were selling their oil for dollars. Even the Saudis, even the United Arab Emirates, even the Kuwaitis were forced to nationalize their oil, even the Shah of Iran. Nonetheless, their wealth still flows into the coffers of U.S. banks and U.S. oil companies. That's due to a deal. For example, last year, Forbes magazine ranked ExxonMobil, J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, and General Electric as the 3 wealthiest companies in the world. And much of their wealth still comes from what amounts to tribute that's paid to them by the Saudi monarchy and the other 5 royal families of the Arabian Gulf. It's a protection racket that basically Henry Kissinger, who was a Rockefeller protege, who was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor under Nixon, said, okay, you can nationalize your oil, you can charge, you can raise the price, but all that money has to come back to the United States, come to Wall Street, it's got to be deposited in our banks, it's got to be or spent on U.S. arms, and and you've got to sell it in dollars, and that flow of tribute is critical to the world position of Wall Street and U.S. imperialism. 2 major Arab oil producers, Iraq and Libya, refused the deal, and they've since paid the price. The Shah of Iran, which is Iran's not an Arab country, but it was a major oil producer, was partner in the arrangement. When he lost his throne in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Chase Manhattan Bank lost its biggest depositor, and General Electric lost its contract to build nuclear power plants for the Shah. The U.S. arms industry lost its biggest overseas customer. It was a major defeat for U.S. monopoly capital, and Iran was added to the U.S. terror list. That's why they hate Iran, not because of nuclear energy. When the USS Vincennes, a missile frigate, shot down an Iranian civilian jetliner over the Gulf in 1988 and killed, I think, 300 people, there was no talk of Iranian nuclear energy then. This war has been going on. Let's see, I think I'm nearing my time. The war against Iraq, in fact, the war against Iraq made possible the U.S.'s position today as the world's leading energy producer. We hear about the fracking destroying farmers in upstate New York or in Ohio, or the attacks on native people's land to make room for pipelines and gas fracking development. That's a continuation of the Iraq War. And it's interesting that when John Kerry was in the run-up to about a month ago, John Kerry met with Henry Kissinger to discuss Syria and Iran. And Kissinger was Secretary of State and Security Advisor at a time kind of similar to now, when the United States was bogged down in a monstrous losing war in Vietnam, and the dollar was in crisis as a result of it. And Kissinger was the architect of this protection arrangement in the Middle East, but he's also he's glorified in U.S. history books as the architect of Detente with the Soviet Union, as the man who arranged the opening of U.S. relations with China, and of the man who got the U.S. out of Vietnam, the Paris peace talks. He was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for that. But Vietnamese Politburo member Lee Duc-Tho refused to share the Nobel Peace Prize because Kissinger was such a war criminal. Because the talks with Vietnam, the peace talks began in 1969. And in the 6 years between that and the U.S. final withdrawal defeat in Vietnam in 1975, we saw the secret bombing of Laos and Cambodia. We saw the Operation Phoenix. We saw the CIA assassination program. We saw the mining of Haiphong Harbor and Nixon's carpet bombing of North Vietnam in 1972, which means imperialists talk peace and make war. And the whole period of Detente, we also saw was accompanied by the overthrow of Allende's government in Chile, which happened on September 11th, the very day that Kissinger met Kerry. We saw the secret war against Angola, done in conjunction with South Africa. We saw it was a bloody time. The war did not stop because for imperialists, peace is an interlude between war. The contradiction, basically the Middle East is at the center of a contradiction that grips imperialism, between the need of oppressed countries, no matter what their social system, to develop their productive forces, and the need of imperialism to stop that. And that contradiction is going to continue to drive U.S. imperialism. And it's also a contradiction with the working class here, because we have no interest in that. We have no interest in keeping down or keeping other countries around the world impoverished. We have no interest in having troops around the world. And just as the anti-war movement did not relinquish when the peace talks were going on in Paris, we cannot relinquish our demands that if you really want peace in the Middle East, bring home the 6th Fleet and the 5th Fleet and the Central Command and all U.S. troops and all CIA stations, and stop all U.S. aid to the racist apartheid state of Israel. That's the only thing that will bring peace part of the world.